Welcome to A Third Way. I am your host, Richard Garner. Today's episode brought to you by our friends at ZeroDB. What is ZeroDB? It's a drink, but it's more than a drink. I'd say it's a life solution in a stressed out world of high anxiety levels and unfortunately all too many options to caffeinate or lift your energy levels artificially. There aren't enough options. In fact, there are very few, if any, that actually help you quiet the noise. And that is what our friends at ZeroDB have brought to us. Again, it's not just a drink. I'd say it's a life solution. Go to drinkzerodb.com and find out where you can either order it on the website or check the store locator. It's in Whole Foods and a bunch of stores probably near you. drinkzerodb.com, check it out and quiet the noise. So we have a doozy for you today. If you're fascinated or freaked out about the future or just interested in the future, there's very few people on the planet that can speak to so many of the areas of interest and concern, whether it's genetic modification, whether it's AI, the future of tech, the future of healthcare, the future of politics. Jamie Metzl is a unicorn in that way. He's an advisor to the WHO. He's on the board of the Singularity University. He is a participant regularly at the World Economic Forum. He was part of the Clinton administration as an advisor. He ran for Congress in 2003. So yeah, he's a real underachiever. He's also a competitive athlete. He's a lot of things, but in this particular context, he's somebody that can bring much needed perspective and insight to not only is what is going on right now in the world with COVID, but also kind of where we're going from here. So today's guest, Jamie Metzl. If we were going to read Jamie's full bio, it would probably take up the whole show. So in brief, Jamie is a technology futurist, a geopolitics expert, a social entrepreneur, a sci-fi novelist, and of course, a much sought out keynote speaker. Jamie's appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience, 60 Minutes, and his TED Talk, Are You Ready for the Genetic Revolution, is a must watch if you want to understand how the future of human evolution is going to unfold. His finger is on the pulse of all things future, and with so much of that said future up in the air right now, who better to help us make sense of it all than Jamie Metzl? And now joining us here on A Third Way is Jamie Metzl. Jamie, how are you?
I'm doing great, Richard. How are you?
I'm good. It's an interesting question these days, obviously, for everyone. Silver linings are what we look for, I think, when dealing with, strife or difficulty. And occasionally, every once in a while, some things happen that give you hope and encourage you for, future issues that are similar. But I'm alluding to, probably the last few weeks, you've been quite busy and you've been talking to people, everybody from Joe Rogan to 60 Minutes. And what has happened from, a few months back and probably for you about a year, where there were, I think obviously very reasonable, rational perspectives given on where origins for COVID could have come from. And of course, as we know, even people like yourself with the pedigree that you have in terms of credibility, in terms of being part of, some of the most, credible organizations in the world, we're still labeled like, this guy's, conspiracy, whatever it is. And it's taken a while, but for whatever reason, we'll get to perhaps some of those reasons as to why the shift. But give us a sort of a background on your process for looking at the quote unquote China lab leak theory when you did, why the evidence spoke to you, and then why it maybe took so long for people to come around.
Yeah. So thanks for asking, Richard. This may take a little while, but I'll try to make it as interesting and exciting as I think it is. And I'll start more than a year ago in the earliest days of the pandemic, when we heard the story of this outbreak. We heard the story that it came from a wet lab in Wuhan. And I had just been back from Wuhan, and I knew that Wuhan wasn't some little backwater where a bunch of yokels are eating bats for dinner every night. I knew that Wuhan is China's Chicago. It's a highly sophisticated, wealthy, highly educated city. So that started to look a little strange to me. And it took about 5 minutes of digging to find the report out in the Lancet showing that about 40% of the earliest cases of infection with COVID-19 from the SARS-CoV-2 virus were people who had no contact with that wet lab. And the Chinese authorities had that. So I asked myself, geez, well, why, from the earliest days in the pandemic, why is the Chinese government lying about its origin? I also knew, I used to live in Cambodia and I studied China and for a long time, that these kinds of pathogenic outbreaks, particularly and exclusively ones connected to horseshoe bats, you would expect those in the parts of southern China where horseshoe bats live, not more than 1,000 miles to the north in Wuhan. So Wuhan doesn't have horseshoe bats in the summer. It certainly doesn't have them in winter, which is when the outbreak began. But I also knew what else Wuhan has. And Wuhan has China's only level 4 virology institute, with the world's largest collection of coronaviruses and bat coronaviruses, that was doing aggressive gain-of-function research designed to push the ability of these highly pathogenic viruses and make them more able to infect human cells, with a spotty safety record. And that raised a lot of questions for me. And early on, last year, in the earliest days of the pandemic, I started raising them. And I was in a unique position because I have a background both in science, and as you mentioned in the intro, I'm author of the book Hacking Darwin, I'm a member of the World Health Organization Advisory Committee on Genome Editing, but I also have a background in Asia and in China. I've been a student of China for decades. So as a person with a background in science, I knew, well, how can these types of outbreaks begin? And that raised a lot of questions. And as a person with a background in China, when I started to see this very early on, this evidence of the cover-up, destroying samples, hiding databases and other records, imprisoning journalists, asking tough questions, quickly establishing a universal gag order on Chinese scientists, preventing them from speaking, it reminded me of so many other experiences from modern Chinese history, whether it's the basically disappearing of the historical record of Mao's terrible atrocities, and which led to the deaths of some 47 million Chinese people as a result of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, or the suppression of the evidence when the first SARS outbreak happened, or when China had its speed rail network, and early on, one of the trains crashed. And what did they do? They dug a big hole, pushed the train into the hole, and covered it up. They eventually had to dig it back up because there was a popular outcry. So that raised a lot of questions for me, and
as it should.
Yeah, exactly. And so I openly last year, first I started speaking, and then early on, I started building my website, and I just put all of the evidence that I could find from every source. And that historical record, that evidentiary record, it just grew and grew and grew. And very quickly, that became kind of the go-to source for journalists, for governments around the world. Then in July of last year, in July of 2020, I had an editorial in the Wall Street Journal, which is, as far as I know, was the first piece in any major news organization making the case that lab leak was a serious hypothesis, because there had been a concerted effort last year, not just by the Chinese government, but by the Chinese government and a small number of virologists, some of whom with a vested interest, in trying to label just asking the most basic questions about COVID origins as a conspiracy theory. So I was in a very uncomfortable position for all of last year. which was I was saying something that I really believed, that we have to thoroughly examine all COVID-19 origin hypotheses, including accidental lab leak. But I was being labeled a conspiracy theorist. I'm a progressive and a Democrat. I have people in my own party who were saying, you're just empowering Trump, you're supporting racism. And I kept saying, no, this isn't about Trump.
Mm-hmm.
This is about getting to the right answer.
Well, but that's such a perfect sort of segue, let's say, to, the broader conversation of the implications of this type of suppression of truth and information, and of just the process of questioning, which is, for me, it's about as big a topic in terms of importance these days, especially, as I can think of. So let's unpack a little bit about what you talked about there. Of course, the Wall Street Journal, for people that don't know, it's owned by News Corp and Rupert Murdoch. They lean a little more conservative. They would potentially have been open to that op-ed at that time for the reasons that you're sort of alluding to, is that this became so politicized. And because it was put out there by, let's say, Trump and that administration, A, it was immediately dismissed. But B, to your point, this became now a bigger, broader, the end justifies the means type of situation that, look, we can't validate anything Trump and that group is saying when we're in the midst of a potentially, existential election. So all of a sudden...
let me just stop you there for a second, because yes, it's true. And it was also true that Trump was using this story, because there's a reason why we have more than 500,000 dead in the United States, and Taiwan has 10. And it's not about the origins. It's about the catastrophic and historical failure of the Trump administration, more than the Trump administration here. So I definitely think that it was right to say that lab leak, and as I said it, is a very real hypothesis. But it was more complicated because Trump was so clearly using this for extremely nefarious political purposes.
Strategic, for self-serving.
Made it so complicated for people. And that's why, coming back to what I said and what you said, that's why all we can do is say, well, my goal is to get to the truth, and to do it in a respectful way, in an honest way, a data-driven way, a way that rejects any type of racism, but getting to the truth.
But that's so again, a perfect segue, because you use the word complicated. Life, Jamie, as you know, is complicated, man. Yeah. And it's certainly not dualistic. And we could talk all day about how the media is limited in the media, but it's really limited to reductionism and to this or that. And when you get into issues, like you said, that are super complex, that involve, yes, it's a little bit of this is true, while also that is true. Holding these paradoxes together in a world that is so divided and so, let's say, conscious of not giving fodder to the other side, I worry about if people like yourself, with your record, and again, your pedigree around objectivity, can not be listened to, and even worse, be labeled as a conspiracy theorist for bringing all very, vetted information, in your words, circumstantial, but still legitimate enough to say, yes, let's objectively look at that possibility as well as this possibility. And when that gets steamrolled, as you know, at this level, people now are in peril. People can die when we have those types of, let's say, subjective blind spots. How do we fix that? Because this is not the first time we're probably going to have to deal with that.
Yeah, and I don't have a complete answer to that question, but we can each do our role by trying to be honest and trying not to be swayed by our starting point or our orientation. I mean, for me, like I said, I'm a progressive. I recognize that I'm now saying things that people, the likes of Fox News and others, are amplifying for whatever mix of reasons. But I feel like I need to just say, well, I'm going to try to speak openly and honestly. And I just feel like in so much of our conversation is so tribal, and we saw it here in the United States. I mean, before Trump, there were all these conservatives say, "Oh, we're against the Soviet Union, we're against Russia," and then there's this message, "Oh no, Russia's good," and then everybody kind of switches sides. And oh, now I might think that the core for all of us is say, well, what are the principles that we believe in? And then how can we best do our bit to as openly and honestly live up to those principles? And if that means we need to occasionally be at odds with people who we see as our kind of community, we need to be willing to do that, because otherwise we will get stuck in a manipulated tribalism that will lead us nowhere.
Yeah, and we're certainly feeling it. And if it's not at least talked about and addressed, whether here, whether elsewhere, I think we are in danger of ultimately things that are detrimental to all of us, because blind spots don't, like, for instance, there was an article in the Scientific American called "The Science COVID Wars," and it was incredibly well respected, high pedigree people. Again, Jeannie Lenzer, award-winning, Shannon Brownlee, and again, admitted progressives actually also. But what they had seen over the course of the year was when people were coming to the table with, let's say, new data, new information, and I don't mean people, I mean decorated Ivy League level scientists who had conducted clinical trials and research, who had never had a hard time getting published before. We're now all of a sudden not only potentially being rebuffed, but being attacked for anything that didn't. And of course, the temperature is high. I get that. This is a fluid situation. People are confused. People are scared. But again, somebody like yourself who so believes in science and the core elements of what ultimately make up science, which is objectivity, like you talked about, and the ability to openly allow your work to be questioned. If we lose that, Jamie, in times where we need it the most, it just feels to me like we're going to be talking in 5 or 10 years saying, well, in retrospect, if we knew now or then what we know now, and people like yourself are going to say we did.
Right. Yeah. And that brings us back to the story that I was telling before, because there was this orthodoxy in the kind of mainstream scientific community that in many ways was driven by the virologists, because there was a story. It was a good story. If the story of COVID was, and maybe it could even be true, but was that it was human encroachment on wild spaces and climate change. Now we know for sure that increases the risk of outbreaks. But if the story was, well, this outbreak came from that would really be a shot in the arm, not just for the discipline of virology, but for our efforts to slow climate change and to end the destruction of wild spaces, which we absolutely must do. So I get that there could be a well-intentioned desire to have this be the story. It's just that it may not be the actual truth. And that was why, so picking up on the story that I started to tell earlier, so in the beginning of this year, we started to make progress. I had a piece in Newsweek that went viral. Nicholson Baker had a great piece in New York Magazine that a lot of people read. And so the space was opening up, but we knew that there was this I don't want to call it investigation. There was a joint study team made up, which had been authorized by the World Health Assembly, which is the states that govern the World Health Organization. They had authorized a joint study into the origins of COVID, and the language of that had been highly manipulated and softened, frankly, by the Chinese government. And so we had a lot of concerns about this process, where it was an independent international committee and the Chinese government that were together looking into COVID origins, and the Chinese government had a veto over who got to be an international member of the committee. It was structured in a way the Chinese government did the primary research and only shared some findings with the international committee. There were all kinds of problems with it. And then on February 9th, this joint study team did a press event in Wuhan where they said, we shouldn't investigate further the possibility of a lab leak, but we should investigate the unlikely but possible hypothesis of frozen food cold chain transmission. And so I and we were just stunned. There's a community of scientists and other experts around the world who for months had been meeting and sharing data, presenting papers to each other, really trying to dig to understand the origins of the pandemic. And here we had what we all felt was a highly credible hypothesis, but still a hypothesis. And this committee, which was a co-committee with the Chinese government, was saying, well, let's not look into it further. Obviously, the Chinese government isn't going to want to look into it further, but we shouldn't just accept that. So what we decided to do was to issue an open letter. And the reason, I think the instinct of most of the members of the group who were in the academic world was why don't we write a scientific paper and present it to Nature or one of the other big journals? And what I said to them, because they're not going to accept it, because we are iconoclasts. There is a dominant story, and we are not part of that. And so if we want to change that, we need to change the broader environment. And so we did put together and collectively write and I was the lead drafter of this, but it was a joint effort, an open letter, which we released. It was in pretty much every newspaper in the world. And that, I think, opened up the space that gave 60 Minutes the confidence to say, well, maybe there's a real story here. And Leslie Stahl and Rich Bonin, the producer, they were really courageous because they took on something and they told this story. And that's why things, I think, have really opened up now. And when this joint study team issued their report, it was immediately followed by just a fantastic comment by Dr. Tedros Adhanom, the WHO Director General, essentially refuting what they had done and calling for a full investigation into all of the hypotheses, including lab leak, and basically saying, well, if this team can't do a full investigation of lab leak, I'm willing to select and deploy a team that can.
And I don't want to get you in hot water, so I'll just say my personal definition of courage for the likes, let's say, of 60 Minutes would have been doing the story 6 months ago, a year ago, before other people had to make the space safe for journalists to do the story, but I digress.
Well, no, but let me talk about that, because it's a really important part of what happened last year. So there was a problem. I talked about that I have a background in science and in China, but most people don't. And so for the people in the science community, I think it was really hard for them to internalize that the Chinese government could even conceivably have begun such a massive cover-up on day one. I think they felt they were dealing with Switzerland, and if the Wuhan Institute of Virology said, "Oh, we didn't have these viruses in our repository," well, that's like, you know, the Swiss Institute of Virology, and if the Chinese government, so the scientists who are data-driven didn't have the data that they needed to make a firm conclusion. And so they were forced to rely on deductive logic, which isn't how they operate. The journalists, though, who didn't know the science, they couldn't come out with this kind of report when they didn't have scientists who were willing to speak publicly and on the record. And that was why when I said that when our group came out with this, with our open letter, it not only created that space, it created, I mean, we had 26 addressees, 26 people who were putting our careers on the line, our reputations on the line in support of what we were calling for, which is a full and unrestricted investigation. So I do understand why journalists were in a tough position, because the scientists weren't validating what many journalists may have suspected.
Well, I know a lot of journalists. I spent 25 years in the media, and I've seen and been privy to threads that are sent to me, not anonymously, but certainly with discretion. And I've witnessed discussions in newsrooms across North America about not how to cover, like not whether to cover news exactly, but how to cover the news. Meaning, and again, this stuff is unprecedented. I'm not saying it's entirely unprecedented. I'm saying that the level to which people were literally going to discuss whether to cover something, whether to report something, and how to report it relative to the potential results that would give in terms of giving these people fodder, that people, was unlike anything I've ever seen. And when asked directly, are you pitching stories that are potentially not aligned with the mainstream narrative of things? And the answer was a flat out, across the board, unequivocal, no, I am not. And that environment and that temperature that ultimately gets people afraid to talk, to your point, you use the word courage. I don't think it can be glossed over, because to your point, even Jeannie Lenzer and Shannon Brownlee were told by scientists, I won't even speak to you off the record in some cases. And they, of course, had to get lawyers after, because they were. So it speaks to the overall environment. But let's shift back to.
But let me just say one more thing on that, because it's so important. So I had lots of conversations last year with world famous scientists. Like if your listener said I'd list, the 5 scientists who are the people who are kind of public figures writing books and whatever. And I spoke with some of them. One person said, look, I think there's a 90% chance that the lab leak hypothesis is correct. But I don't dare say it publicly because I can't prove it, and because speaking up would be career suicide. And I heard that over and over and over. And then certainly it was this toxic environment, and the Trump administration intentionally fueled that toxic environment. And then people rightly feared that even things that they said because they believe them could be used and manipulated, which is even the case now. I mean, I just got a very, touching message from a very, very close friend of mine in Hong Kong, who's saying, I see what you're doing, whatever your intentions are, this is fomenting racism. And I've spent my entire life as a human rights campaigner fighting racism, and I absolutely and unequivocally condemn any kind of abuse against anybody, particularly the idea that anybody in Asia, that just by being Asian, that someone's connected to this story. But that doesn't mean I'm not sensitive to that. And I think we have to be. We have to recognize life happens in a context.
Doesn't that speak? I mean, it's an interesting, this could be, a university course, an accredited course, perhaps taught by Jamie Metzl, but because in reality, we all talk about the pursuit of truth as though it's a given that we all want it. But what we really start to understand when we peel back the layers of the onion, let's say, is that in almost all cases, especially the higher you go, whether it be politically, whatever the institution or structure is, when you're talking about things, to your point, sensitive things like race, et cetera, where we get to often is, okay, do the pros outweigh the cons, or does the end justify the means? And okay, is it for the greater good? And sometimes, to your point, you have to weigh these things. Of course, you have to weigh these things. And I know you're a thoughtful person that would weigh these things. However, if the truth of something, like I would have no problem saying that the history of China in certain areas is I think legitimately on the record historically is questionable. I remember I lived in Africa, in Western Africa, in 2006. And I remember being there, in the middle of nowhere, and all of a sudden running into 3, people from China in suits and asking somebody, what's this all about? I said, oh, they're buying up a whole bunch of whatever. And it was the beginning of my understanding of the relationship of China and Africa over the course of the next X amount of years, almost 20 years. So we're not children. We understand that there's There's games and agendas going on in the world. There's a game of risk, if you will. And these things play into these types of issues. How do you balance these things? Because to your point, personally, you have friends that you don't want to hurt them.
Right.
Politically, you have alliances that you want to, you believe are you're kind of on the right side, so you don't want to whatever. But at the end of the day, sometimes the truth gets in the way of all of that. How do you reconcile that?
Yeah, and there's no easy answer other than to be as fully aware of the issues as you go. And I'll make it very concrete. I have dedicated a lot of my life to thinking about the ethical applications of genetic technologies. I was extremely honored when 2 years ago I was invited to be a member of the World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing. As a matter of fact, our report is coming out very soon. And so when I started raising these issues and raising fundamental questions about this joint study, and even though the international committee was independent, it was organized and largely appointed by the WHO. And so most people, I mean, it's fuzzy for everybody, myself included, how it's appointed and organized by the WHO, but it's also an independent committee. So there was a big risk for me, not only in potentially sabotaging my relationship with the WHO, but even more so I feared, well, what happens if I undermine the efficacy of the WHO at a time like now when the world needs it more than ever? But I did feel that I had an important role in separating out that the WHO and Dr. Tedros is very, very different from this joint committee, this joint study group of the independent committee and their Chinese government counterparts. And the reason why the WHO had played that role is that their bosses, the states, had instructed them to do so. And that's why I was always very clear. I strongly support the WHO. I support Dr. Tedros, but I condemn this sham of a joint study. I mean, asking the Chinese government to control the investigation into whether there had been an accidental lab leak is just, as I said on 60 Minutes, it's like asking the Soviet Union to investigate Chernobyl. It's just absurd. But the WHO was trying to do its best. And there was a real risk. And that was why I was just so pleased when Dr. Tedros put out his incredibly courageous statement on March 30th, saying, no, I don't care what this joint study team says. We have to investigate all hypotheses, and I'm going to build a team that can do that. And so sometimes it's like we have to be conscious of the risks, but we have to do the right thing, not blindly as some kind of zealot. And sometimes it works out. I feel like my relationship now with the WHO is stronger than ever. As a matter of fact, I was doing a Fox Radio interview this morning, and I like doing Fox interviews, even though I'm a progressive, because every chance I get, I say, one, this moment shows that we need the WHO, that we can't do this alone. This is a global pandemic. And for all of you people who have been saying that Dr. Tedros is a stooge of the Chinese, he just risked his entire career to stand up to Chinese manipulation. And if you can't recognize that, then you're not doing what I said before of just looking at the evidence and doing an honest assessment.
Better late than never?
I don't think so. I think that's this job of the WHO Director General requires balancing. I mean, the WHO Director General is appointed by states, answers to states. That's his boss. So people are critical that the WHO didn't sound the alarm in the earliest days of the pandemic. But we, as the states, the countries, haven't given the WHO the authority, the mandate to have its own surveillance network. So the way it gets information in a lot of areas is the states give it to the WHO. And so even though there were private concerns, how could we expect them to draw their own conclusions when we haven't given them the ability to do their own examination. People were critical that the WHO didn't have people on the ground on day one in Wuhan, but they wanted to, they just didn't get visas. There's no mechanism. If they want to send their people to Wuhan or some other hotspot and they don't get visas, there's no automatic referral to the UN Security Council. There's no emergency intervention that's even possible. They just have to wait and beg and hope. And that was the case here. So I'm not saying, and nobody would say that the WHO was perfect, but I just feel that blaming the WHO for structural shortcomings that we helped create isn't intellectually honest.
So that's again a good pivot here, because you know, the legacy, let's say, and I mean I'm speaking about it as though it's in the past, which it clearly is not, of the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, there's a few takeaways. I mean, I've interviewed, you know, Dr. Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb in 1968. I mean, they were talking about, you know, that was the beginning really of overpopulation being a sort of a major discussion, and that of course dense populations in cities, et cetera, it was just 2 + 2 = 4. You would have, you know, viral contagions as part of everyday life. You know, these were things we had to think about, prepare for, et cetera. There's no reason to believe there won't be others, and it certainly feels like that because this is such an inflection point, let's say, for where we're going to go as a collective, that everything's on the table now. You mentioned surveillance, which a lot of people are not comfortable with, me included, depending, you know, because of the track record of the surveillors, both public and private.
No, but you want, even people who are cautious about that, we want viral surveillance. We want somebody checking to make sure that there's not some deadly pathogenic outbreak. That doesn't mean there's going to be somebody monitoring your phone calls. Yeah,
fair enough. And but regardless, also too expanding, you know, like, because to your point, infrastructure, this demonstrated that when you have jurisdictional decision making across the world, you're just going to have a whole bunch of different approaches to something that is not an individual problem. It's an interconnection, interdependent problem.
Yes, and you and I, Richard, we've talked about this before, and it's connected to the work that you've done, to the work that I'm now doing with One Shared World. I mean, it sounds so kind of esoteric and even frankly annoying to say that what we have now with this pandemic is a Westphalia problem. And I'm sure people are scratching their head, Westphalia, WTF is that? And as some people know, it's the peace that ended the 30 Years' War in the 17th century that established our modern concept of the nation state. The reason why we have a weak WHO that couldn't have a strong intervention and stop this pandemic on day one, it's Westphalia. We live in a world of global problems, but our solutions are predominantly national. And that mismatch between those two, that's where pandemics happen, climate change, ecosystem destruction, proliferating weapons of mass destruction. All these global problems are unaddressed because our primary problem-solving mechanisms exist on the national level.
So here's, and I'm glad you laid that out, and that, you know, you're referring to One Shared World, and you know, I went down the road on something called the One Network, you know, really about a little over 10 years ago, before, with the same sort of ideals, I guess, that, you know, the science, I don't even want to say the science, the facts at every level point to the fact that everything is interconnected. Well, therefore, if it's interconnected, there's only one logical way to coexist on the planet, interdependently. That's 2 + 2 = 4. It's not a subjective opinion. So then how do we do that? So people ask me all the time, so you're a person that's all about sort of oneness in the world. I say, yeah. Well, I say it's not whether I'm about it. That's the facts. Everything's an ecosystem. Everything's, you know, organically interconnected, whether we can see it or not. Now, in the aspirational view of that, when people say, okay, well, what do you, would you, so Star Trek type stuff? I said, yeah, like, sign me up. Like, there's definitely that aspect of that aspirational idea that we're all, together and we're all sort of working together as one. But then they say, so you're pro one world government. And I'd say, okay, listen, this is where it gets complex, as you talked about earlier. And when we get into, and you and I have talked about this before, and I think quite reasonably people look at the people who show up, and I know you've participated in the World Economic Forum and you're there to make sure that, I think a lot of the things that you believe in are integrated into the conversations and processes. But then there's people that say, well, look, there's tons of people who were actually part of causing a lot of the climate problems, a lot of the wealth disparity problems. And wait a sec, now we're supposed to listen to them as they chart the course for Humanity 2.0? I don't think so. And there's a national distrust there. How do you balance that? How do you reconcile that as we move towards trying to live more interdependently?
So first, I totally agree with you. When people talk about the Declaration of Interdependence that I was the lead drafter of, they say, oh, you're for one world government. And what I always say is I'm totally against one world government, at least anytime remotely soon. Because we live in a world of states, and states have done a lot of good. And it would be insane to say we should get rid of this mechanism that has actually done a lot of good. It also has shortcomings. And one of the biggest shortcomings is now that we've become a global species, we need, as I was saying before, to solve problems on a global level, which requires some kind of mechanism. So it's not get rid of the nation states. It's recognize that there are some problems that we can only solve together. And how can we build the kind of norms and structures that allow us to do that? And frankly, if we do it, it will strengthen our nation states, because things like climate change, like pandemics, like these big global problems, I mean, they kind of weaken most everybody. I mean, there's an argument to be made, which is tragic, that China has become relatively stronger as a result of the pandemic, that however it started, China's monumental screw up in very least the first month is a big part of this pandemic story. But there's a whole set of problems that we cannot solve on our own. And so no one is saying get rid of the nation state. No one's saying don't love your country. But what we must do is inspire our leaders to do a better job of balancing our national and our common interests. And to do that, that's what One Shared World is about, as you and I have discussed, Richard. What we want to do is to create an empowered global constituency of people who are demanding that our leaders at every level just do a better job of balancing those local, national, and common interests to optimize all of our well-being. If the pandemic has shown us that just building walls doesn't work. Even North Korea can't build walls to keep this pandemic out. There are these common problems, and we need to figure out how to do it. And part of that is redefining the job description for our leaders at every level.
Well, and I agree. And again, we could talk all day and another day about, Silicon Valley and tech and what I feel and where they are agenda-wise. And that's a bit of a generalization. But the one thing you can't argue with is their leapfrog strategy, which is, you guys keep talking. It's the old Buckminster Fuller thing. Forget about trying to tear down the old system. Just build the new one and people will come. And I remember a press conference here in Toronto where the mayor stood up and he was like, Uber's not coming here. We have we have rules and regulations that protect. Cut to a month later, he's holding a press conference. He's like, well, what are you going to do? They're here. So we got to figure it out. And I think the ideas of one shared world, build the consensus first of the people. And we know at the end of the day, leaders are political animals. If they see the wind is blowing at a certain direction where you have a massive consensus of people saying, we want this, to me, it acts as like a buying group almost, for lack of a less clumsy way to say that. It's a way to be able to get almost like a political action committee to some degree that I think is going to be the way, because it's not necessary. I think it's too hard in the current political system, especially in the West. And we could talk all day about how China's been able to leapfrog North America because of the lack of that. but I think it's grassroots organizations like yours that are going to lead the way, hopefully. And I'd be remiss if before I let you go. And I mean, it's a bit of a cliche trope to what are you optimistic about what is your whatever? But in the case for the people that don't know, in his spare time, Jamie also is a best-selling sci-fi writer. So in this particular case, it would be, I think, irresponsible of me not to ask how you envision, with your, again, sort of unicorn level balance of actual real world experience and expertise and access that allows you to have way more psi than phi, let's say, in your books. When somebody asks you about, what are you really seeing in 2030 in the world? Yeah. How do you answer them?
So I think one of the big stories for this pandemic time that we'll look back on, it's not just virtualization, although we found that we can kind of live our lives in Zoom and these other virtual spaces, and that's big, and it's not going away. But I also think that we'll look back at this time that the pandemic supercharged the genetics and biotech revolutions. Those revolutions were already charging forward, but now they've just been ramped up, and it's not just about vaccines. We're going to see a fundamental transformation of our healthcare using these mRNA platforms, but lots more with these same tools. We're going to revolutionize how we think about extracting natural resources, whether it's energy or raw materials that go into making things, or agriculture, how we think about food, and whether it's cellular agriculture, brewing things that would otherwise maybe we would grow, thinking about using microbes to replace a lot of our use of fertilizer, disrupting the cow. So rather than, the animal agriculture has just a huge environmental footprint, but we're going to be able to basically precision brew milk, precision brew meat. And, wow. And it's going to lead to a pretty significant restructuring of how we live in ways that have the potential to be really positive. I mean, how many people, billions of people in the world, don't have access to high quality proteins, high quality foods? How much environmental damage are we doing from our nitrogen-based fertilizers, from industrial farming and industrial cattle and chicken farms and all these kinds of things? So there's a really positive story. And like every story, there's the potential for a downside. And that's why we need to talk about the science. We need to should be, I think, excited about the science. We need to recognize that our values must be woven into every decision that we make. And to make that even possible, we need to be having conversations like this. People need to start not just getting comfortable with the ideas, but feeling confident enough to raise their voices, to ask questions to their political leaders, to start educating themselves. Because one thing we know is that the future is coming, and it's coming at us probably faster than most people appreciate.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way I think personally, again, I don't want to be too cynical about the political process in most places, but I think the way to really impact and have your voice heard is grassroots organizations, and ultimately building up that capacity for people to communicate, collaborate, and co-create Humanity 2.0. Where can people find One Shared World? How can they participate?
Oh, that's great. So people can go to oneshared.world, and if you like, sign the Pledge of Interdependence to join us and get on our mailing list. We have amazing young people, college kids, graduate students who are volunteers, who are really driving things forward. If you'd like to volunteer, there's a place to volunteer. If you'd like to learn more about my book, Hacking Darwin, you can go to hackingdarwin.com. And if you want to learn more about me or sign up for my newsletter or read if you print it out, it'll be 40 pages. So don't print it out. Just look on my blog post on the origins of SARS-CoV-2, which has, I think it's probably the most thorough compilation of the evidence, at least the evidence suggesting why I believe a lab leak is a very, very possible origin of the pandemic. That's at my jamiemetzl.com website.
And great stuff. And again, you can go down the Jamie Metzl YouTube rabbit hole. There's great interviews recently and a couple years back with Joe Rogan. You know, there's the aforementioned 60 Minutes interview, and there's a great TED Talk that I strongly recommend for people. If you want to understand, you know, this post-evolutionary phase that we're in and that's accelerating at a breakneck speed, Jamie Metzl's perspectives on this are pretty unique in the world. So I strongly recommend you checking that out. Jamie, thanks for joining us. Keep up the good work, and we'll catch up with you down the line.
Thanks so much, Richard. Always a pleasure.